it's good to think about how you will tell the story of what you're doing, either as an immediate project thing or as an ongoing story. So we're going to just run through a bit about why we're going to evaluate, how we kind of get everybody on board in that evaluation process, thinking about the sort of nitty-gritty of how you kind of break down what it is you want to evaluate, and how you then measure that, collect the data, and then sit back and review things. So this is a sort of, I guess, a kind of generic kind of scoot through evaluation. There are all sorts of other elements of evaluation that people like to discuss. We're also partners with the Centre for, oh, somebody's got their mic on. There's a little scuffling. We're co-directors with the Centre for Cultural Value, and I'm sure you're aware of the work that they have been doing around the principles of evaluation, and there's a link as we go. So our approach is very user and people-centred, and we're very strong on collecting that robust evidence base that really supports being able to tell that story, whether it's quantitative data or qualitative data, and that this really reflects, you know, the process that you are undertaking, as well as the things that happen as a result. So, sorry, ignore that Menti one. So yeah, evaluation, I think, you know, I'm sure there are some opinions and thoughts and ways that people describe it, but I think I like this one with it's a sort of structured interpretation and giving of meaning to things that you kind of planned, or things that emerge from what you're doing. And it does, you know, evaluation in a way is very useful and it helps you with your objectives, so that you can start at the end and kind of imagine that picture of what it is that you've achieved, and then you're working your way back to how you're going to get to that kind of vision of what you want to accomplish. And as I say, it could be a project, it could be something quite specific, and it's not, you know, market research is not something that you do as a sort of formative thing. It's not something that you do in to sort of plan something. It's not polling, it's not bringing together kind of data sets in a way that you might look at in order to inform what you do. This is the thing that you do at the end. But obviously there are things that you might do at the beginning, so that you can check your change from different data sets, but you need to be quite specific about what you're evaluating. And it's not just about asking questions of people and getting their views, it's about you checking against what you set out to do to see whether it happened, and happened in the way that you were hoping, and that your process of getting people to, or your beneficiaries to, the outcomes worked, and that they did get what you were hoping they would get out of it. So there are two broad reasons why you might want to do something in the evaluation zone. One is this kind of summative. So typically this is reporting to funders and stakeholders. It's informing a good story, or it's reporting back to your kind of artists and participants and partners. So that's kind of saying, this is all that happened, and this is, you know, how it looked. You might also do you use evaluation to kind of do ongoing planning, either within the period of a project or as a result of a project. So the outputs from your evaluation that you're looking for are intended to inform work going forward. So if it's a long-term project and you want to improve from one project to the next, or you want to share your learnings with the sector as a really great way of doing things. So you can see they both complement each other, but that formative, that kind of using evaluation to improve things, to develop practice, to kind of share a good way of doing things, is obviously really important, and is often quite difficult when you're kind of delivering something and you're in that mode. I really like to kind of look at the other kind of different aspects of your evaluation. One is this kind of process, like how did you do it? What did you do in order to get to the outcomes? How did you organize yourself? What partners did you have? What was your process? What was your technique? What was your practice? So it's how it was developed in order to have your desired outcomes, and who was involved in that process. And then the other part is obviously who benefited, how did they benefit, and does that represent a change? Now, it could be a change, I guess, for you as an organization, or it could be a change also for the people that you work with or the other kind of partners that you have. So that idea of change is really important in evaluation. It doesn't need to be a kind of massive shift, but what you're trying to do is take, you know, people from one thing to another, or do something that is different for them. Even if it's I've not come to the theatre and now I've come to the theatre, that is a change for people. As I was mentioning earlier, we work by these evaluation principles. So that differentiation between summative and formative and process and outcomes is really important, because you might you're thinking about the process of your evaluation as you are planning and delivering projects, which makes it much more centered on the people who are involved in that, and much more focused on interrogating the relationships within within a project or within your activity. So the evaluation principles really help to kind of ground that process, so that you are doing something. It's very difficult to be totally objective as an evaluator, or if you're doing evaluation, because you have designed a project and you've got desired outcomes. So you really want to, you want to see things that fulfill the ambition. So as these principles are really trying to kind of make you aware of that position, because it's not wrong, it's fine, and make that transparent, but involve people in that, in the kind of questions you ask in the process of it. So these evaluation principles, which there's much more detail than this, is that you are committed up front to learning something. You're not just trying to prove a point, or keep the shiny story going. That you do collect robust evidence, that it is things that you can therefore make decisions as a result of, that it's people-centered, so it reflects the interests and involves the people who are, I guess, the sort of subjects of your evaluation, and that your evaluation doesn't happen in a vacuum. So you have this, to what level are you objective, subjective, and that you talk about that, and that you also, as much as possible, find either other examples or contextual data, or share it through discussion, so that you're not doing things without reference to possibly a whole other range of organizations who might do something similar, or a body of knowledge that exists already. So I think this mitigates against you kind of imagine, people sort of saying, well, we've changed the world doing this, and then you realize that actually what you've done is in that kind of academic way, you've added to the literature, you've added to a body of knowledge, or put in something that is slightly different from what anybody else might have done. So those are the kind of principles, and how one ideally would set off. I know what often happens is that you're kind of planning a project, you've done lots of information gathering, you've applied for funding and made your case in all sorts of different ways, and then you kind of go, oh, we've got to think about how we evaluate. But all that stuff that you do in the process of planning and delivering and getting funding for a project is all good stuff in terms of helping design the evaluation. I mean, ideally, the evaluation is part and parcel of all that activity, and that you are really thinking about it up front and putting the appropriate resources in to evaluate something. And I think that this kind of value of evaluation is best shared as in terms of practically and kind of philosophically across the people in an organization or a project, so that you are all in this conversation, which sort of focuses on, if we start at the end, you know, what is the long-term change or the goal of what you're trying to evaluate, and you're putting that in the context of something where you think, you know, it's not a problem that you necessarily have to solve, or but it's, you know, there's something that we would like to change about the world, or we've seen something that we think we can help with, or we can do something about, or we can change the way people engage or think about cultural creative activity. Or we think, you know, if we could start a conversation using creative techniques, then that would address some kind of particular issues within a community, get people talking. So you're thinking of these two bookends, you know, why are you going to do what you do, and why should it be you and your organization, and what will the world look like once you've done it? What will be different about it? And in the middle, you've got to work out, okay, so if our goal is you know, to introduce people to our museum for the first time who live within, you know, walking distance, and enable them to contribute to what we do, how will you know, how will you be able to sort of know that that's a good thing for those people? So what is it that they will experience? What will you do to enable them to have that kind of change? And how will you kind of invite them in? So there's lots of models of this kind of theory of change, and there's great ones. And let me just go to this one that you can download, and the link is there. And it's great that, you know, the practice of doing this is where whoever's conceived of the project, or whoever might be kind of leading on evaluation, kind of tries to fill it out, and then you have a conversation about the different component parts, so that you can really refine them. And you're always asking yourself, how will we be able to see that change? How will we know if there has been a change? What can we observe? What can we ask? And then you kind of develop from there. But it means that you facilitate something to be much more specific, because there's some quite broad terms that you could say, you know, we will, you know, influence social cohesion in our communities. That's quite broad. So really breaking that down and saying, well, what would that look like? And what are we going to do? And how are we going to do things in order to make that change? So it's that journey towards the goal. So the kind of going back to our purpose thing about it being kind of formative, but also the process of it, as well as the outcomes, and always connecting between those. So sometimes theory of change is called a story of change, and it just depends on how you like to kind of work on these things. Sometimes it's nice to sort of think, okay, so if we worked with this individual, what kind of, you know, who are they? What are they like? You know, why would they involve themselves in the project? What would motivate them? And then think about all the steps that they might go through that would be helpful, or have a change for them, and just track that story in terms of one person. So you can really define things. You can make sure that everybody agrees and that it's collaborative and consensual, and then you're really making sure that you're being specific about things so that you can measure that change. So in this a bit more kind of complicated thing, we've got what's the end goal, what are the wider benefits, what's the measurable things that you can do, because obviously you might be looking for a change that's a little bit longer term. So you need to be clear about what you can actually ask and measure in the moment, in the period of a project. And then you're saying, what are you going to do? What are the steps to bring about change? How are people going to find their way to what you want to do? And who is it you're targeting? And there's obviously a reason why you want to target people with this kind of end goal. And I think in a way you just have to try it if you've not done it before, and then just get other people involved. And the assumptions and things along the bottom are probably based on your practice, that if we work with young people who are not in education, employment and training and do something creative, it invariably does enable them to express things that they wouldn't express in other contexts or in a formal setting. So you can put in those assumptions, but you've got to be very specific about what you're going to do that will bring about that kind of change. So I think this is just some ideas of bits and pieces that you might do. So what activities, projects, programs will, you will be designed to bring about the change. So you might be focusing on skills development. And I think that can be very specific skills if people have are creative in one way and you want to develop that, or it might be broader kind of life skills in terms of building people's confidence. See what's going on here. You might be focused on attracting and engaging people with arts and culture for the first time, and thinking what you might do there. You might want to kind of co-create or work with a community so that they have a greater ownership of whatever it is you might be wanting to do, and that kind of empowers a community and has more kind of broader social capital kind of impacts. You might decide that it's got to be a drop-in and free because it just introduces families to your venue. So you're relating the kind of what you're going to do to the things that you want to get out of it. And if you do artist mentoring, it might increase their chances of career development. So if you just think of these kind of broader things in the first instance, it can be helpful. So I'm just going to ask you to do a little bit of reflection. And if you're happy to, in whatever device you have, you can put into search under menti.com and put in that number. And, very shortly, just think about, if you think about your organization or the projects that you do, just a quick short example of the change that you would like to make. And I'm going to just stop sharing this, and then I can see the Menti and I will see some of the comments that come up. We're not going to kind of pick on people or anything, so it's all anonymous, so you can just have a bit of a reflection for a couple of minutes on that. I like this one. Here we go. Increasing self-esteem in young people, reducing isolation. Create collaborations between artists and the leisure community. I want to have communities that feel that they have ownership within the museum and feel empowered to use the collections and benefit from them. Some one's coming up. Widen the range of people we reach with our creative projects. I'm just trying to get down to improve mental health within the community through creativity. That's a great one. Grow oracy and literary skills through performance storytelling. I think the more specific you can be, the clearer it is to go back through that kind of process. Somebody who's an evaluator support our clients to understand what evaluation is, because it can be confusing. Hopefully, I'll come back to you at the end, whoever said that, and see whether anything I've said helps. Enable small arts organisations to engage with immersive technology. Brilliant. I'll share this in the slides when we come back, so I think you could see the sort of range of things that people are interested in. But it's a useful exercise just to kind of distill it into one specific thing to ensure that your evaluation has that focus. Because I think that is always the challenge with the evaluation, is that, I'm just going to stop sharing that now, is that everybody's kind of coming from their own different perspectives. And you have to sometimes be quite strong and say, no, the reason why we're doing this project is to do this, and this is what we're going to evaluate. Otherwise, it can cover too much. And you're perhaps putting too much pressure on one project to deliver too much for either of the individuals involved or your organisation. So the more specific can be, the more helpful, the more impactful your evaluation would be. Right, I'm just going to go back to my slide set. Thank you, everybody, for contributing there. So then comes the sort of more nitty-gritty work where you wanted to kind of define things so that you're sort of distilling things down. So you really want to know what that change will look like. What will you observe? What will people feel or think or do differently, so that you can kind of identify what's changed. Sometimes, and so you're relating that kind of rather bigger picture to something that could happen, something that people will do, something that people will feel, something that people can talk about. So the two might not be exactly the same things. So I always use this slightly daft example, is that, you know, from a sort of local authority perspective, if they have things around social cohesion or community integration and things like that, their metrics are often things like how many people volunteer in the community, how many people vote, or what's the crime rate. So these are kind of proxies for things that are an indication of the state of the sort of community and its relationships with each other. So in this same way, you're sort of saying, okay, if I want people to have a warmer relationship with our museum, the first step is that they attend. So it can be quite simple, straightforward things, and you find out where they're from. Then you're kind of going into how do they enjoy the experience and what you can ask them about the experience. And then you're asking them about what they might have taken away from that experience. And then obviously whether they will come back. So you're breaking things down into the component parts. So you can ask people, I did something new or different. And you can ask them that in the moment, is this something new or different that you did? You could also ask them, you know, what's the likelihood of you doing it again? Obviously, you're then casting forward. So it's a bit more kind of speculative, but you're differentiating between what you can ask them in the moment and then what might be something that they could do over time. So you can say, having gone around somewhere or experienced something, or I know more about something, which might mean that they grow a greater interest in that subject or in other things. I'm inspired to go and research other things I'm interested in. So you're differentiating with the specific and what that then might mean for somebody or what they might go on to do next. You say in a project, an interactive project, my confidence has grown. You can ask why, and then say, I am now more confident to do other things. I'm now more confident to join my local theatre group. I'm now more confident to bring my children to this gallery or exhibition. This one around I met new people is a very strong one when we're thinking about, you know, community cohesion and social integration, that you feel confident around other people and that you have met people who you perhaps might normally not speak to, or they might be different to you. And that leads to this idea that they perhaps feel more part of their community. More active, we design something together. And then if you've managed to do something together with one group of people, or you could take that same group of people and think, actually, well, maybe we're stronger together and we can influence other things. So these are sort of more kind of active citizen area. Or simply, this many people came and it therefore brought this much income to our organisation or businesses, if revenue generation is important, or economic impact in its broadest sense. So there are some things you can ask in the moment and other things that you might either need to use other data for, or to ask people to kind of cast forward a little bit. So this is the other tool from the theory of change, and you know, I think you have to just find the headings and the columns that work best for you, because there's always lots of discussion about goals, objectives and aims. I think just, you know, as long as there's clarity about what they are. And then again, it's useful to look at some of these specifics. If you've got that rather broader picture of the arc of change and kind of what you're going to do in that theory of change, this is really about getting quite practical, where you're saying, okay, what do we need to do this? What are the resources, or the people, the money? The outputs are all the things you can kind of count. How many activities, how many people, how many places, all those sorts of things. And then the outcomes are the benefits that people have, which are those sorts of things that you can ask immediately in the moment. And then you can cast forward about the kind of wider or longer term impact, which is then related back to your goal in the theory of change. So these, I think the thing in here, the output's usually pretty straightforward, because you know, you can count people up, you can count people of different demographics, you can assess how many people that were there. I think it's these outcomes that are always the thing to get really quite specific about, because then that is going to tell you the sorts of things that you need to ask people. So what does this change look like? What do people feel, and how do they benefit from what you've done? Ah, yes, sorry, my arrows, I've realized what my arrows are. So it's quite good to go backwards and forwards along this, so that you're always following the logic up and down, so that, you know, the things that you do are definitely things that are going to result in the outcomes and impacts. And when you start at the end, you go, well, these are the impacts, so how will we know they have happened because of the things that we're doing? So it's quite good just to kind of keep going backwards and forwards and checking on these things. So then you have to get even more specific, where you're saying, okay, so what is it we're going to ask? What is it we're going to count? What kind of targets might we have? And these are the indicators, which is obviously encompassed in that title, indicators. So it's something that indicates that you have achieved what you wanted to do. So if it's about revenues, then it's how much was spent by people on things in your activity event. If you just want to get people through the door, what was the attendance, and what was the percentage of families? So you can do ratings, you know, an indication that people felt comfortable, or that it was of a quality, or that they felt welcome, or they thought it was great, I had a good time. People always forget in all this kind of nitty-gritty, sometimes people just forget that actually one outcome is people had fun and they enjoyed themselves. So don't forget that kind of rating along the way, because obviously if you've fun and enjoyed yourself, it has huge kind of well-being implications. You know, yes, I improved some skills. Yes, people interacted and contributed. They might have changed their perceptions. I thought it was like this, and now I think it's like this. And when we're thinking about digital engagement, you know, did a visit to the website mean that you joined a mailing list? So, and then longer term things where you think, actually we're looking for people's progression. So if you were doing some training and skills or apprenticeships, that people went on to get full-time jobs. These are just quick kind of examples. I'm sure you've got your own ones about the sorts of things that you know that you can measure as a result of. And, you know, when you're a venue, it's numbers of people through the door, people coming in groups, people kind of paying different prices. So there's all the different kind of things that might happen in terms of your regular kind of engagement with people, as well as these kind of, you know, more specific where you might be working with very particular groups. So just think about, you know, audience and participation, their profile, whether that's demographics or another segmentation tool that you use, what they did, how many people they came with, you know, you can talk about their motivations, that people came because they wanted to learn, or because they wanted to spend time with their family, or because they wanted to hang out with their friends and have a coffee. And likewise, the motivations, people might be just want to escape and have a relaxation, or they might have some very purposeful motivations to learn something or discover something new. Those experience ratings, did they like it? Do they think it's for them? Do they not think it was them? Do they change their view of something? And then what might they go on to do? So there's obviously, when we come on to the kind of data collection approaches, some of these are much more straightforward to be able to collect, because it's all more kind of documentation, or you're kind of logging your activity. Some things you might get from a ticketing system, or a kind of bars and food. Others, you know, definitely need some kind of survey, and then still others, sometimes it's easier to have that conversation and do things in a more kind of qualitative way. So that's roughly, you know, the blue arrow there just showing you that it gets more qualitative as you get to the end. But it's always great to have a combination of these kinds of data. I think evaluation, is characterized by tables or spreadsheets of various different things from different points of view. So I think it's useful to kind of take your whole project and think, this is the whole project in that logic model way, the outputs and outcomes and indicators and things like that. But you may then have to break it down either into the different aspects of the project delivery, or you might break it down according to the different groups of people who are engaging. So if you have a project that's for younger people and adults, you want to think about them perhaps in different strands. If you have a segmentation approach for your organization, you might want to look at the different outcomes for the different segments that you engage with. If you're working with artists and participants, you might want to see the different journeys that they go on. Or you might want to see the overall effect of one of your strategies or one of your projects. So you might have to look at things from slightly two different perspectives, but doing that is quite good in terms of, you know, just interrogating and checking through your kind of process. So here, you know, this is just one line. I'll put other examples in the things that go around. So the outcomes are, you know, what are you trying to do? What is the change? Outputs, what are the actual things? The indicators are really, you know, if this has changed, or if this percentage is that, it will look like this. And then you can think about how you're going to collect that. So is it going to be quantitative? Is it data is it documentation of what you're doing? Or is it more kind of survey or qualitative? So we'll come in the second part to just think through those different methodologies. And just a final note to say, you know, when you say what changes happened, sometimes you need to be sure that you're knowing what you're going from to. So if you want to increase the proportion of your visitors or audiences of a particular type by 10%, you really need to know what percentage is the starting point, so that you know what's feasible. And it's always really good to think about that in actual numbers as well. And it does relate to how you might collect that data, because some things might not show up in data necessarily. So because of statistical things about robustness and margins of error. But yeah, really thinking, you know, if you say we're going to increase this by, or, you know, just really thinking what the starting point is. And there are, I guess, two ways of doing the baseline. One is to do a piece of research that sets the baseline, or if it's over a period of time, you can kind of track things. So you can just start asking your question and then track things over time, or you might ask at the beginning of the project and then ask at the end of the project. So there are different ways of being able to compare that kind of change for certain kinds of data. And then the other one is where you're bringing more meaning to what you're finding. So you're not referring to things within your project or within the people who are engaged, but you are comparing to something that might be an indicator that is more universal. So you might look at the IQ in schools, so that you can draw on other data sets. So that might be things that are in Audience Finder or Audience Spectrum profiling, or it might be thinking about more kind of census data, or it might be other, if you're in groupings of organizations where you can compare. So just to finish off the session, I'm going to talk about the nitty-gritty of data collection, because as we know, we can have the best evaluation framework and ambitions and ideals that we could ever want, but it all comes down to our ability to collect that data, and often that's where we come up against the challenges of resources and time and space, and also I guess the matching the kind of appropriateness or the suitability of the different data collection methodologies with the people we want to collect data from. So I think it's all those things we kind of have to think about. But in principle, what we are looking for is making sure that we are measuring what we want to measure. I think there's always these things, there's this kind of acronym VUMI, which is that we want to collect very useful data, but not data that is just merely interesting. So really, I think if you're in charge of the evaluation, you have to be quite strong on these things, because people will always say, well, what about this group? Or it's sort of like, oh, if we're asking that, maybe you could just ask all these other things. We always have this challenge that we're doing evaluation and people are focused on how people found out about things, which is obviously incredibly useful for marketing, but may not be at the heart of, might add a whole section to a questionnaire which just makes it too long. So there are decisions. Reliable, so measuring accurately what the data is supposed to be measuring, so that we are really thinking about those indicators and the metrics that we've used, or the measures that we've used, so that when it comes to sharing the evaluation, people feel confident in what it's saying. Because I think the whole, evaluation is there for, project producers and organizations, but we need to make sure that, for instance, when we have a large scale event, an outdoor event, that sufficient number of surveys have been collected, and that it is genuinely a random sample, and that we have been asking the questions that enable us to kind of demonstrate what it is that we were supposed to be doing. So all those things mean that that data is reliable. And we need the opportunity to be able to collect that data. So if there's anything in the framework where you go, well, how would we do that? How would we collect that? How would we ask that? Then you need to kind of rethink it. And if there is not an opportunity to engage a particular group of people or ask them something, either you have to create the opportunity, or it's not something that you're going to be able to evaluate. I think in these days, really getting solid evaluation data from people engaging with digital content, and creative things online, like an online exhibition, is really challenging. And so there might be some elements where you're saying, well, let's have a go and see if it works, but always be monitoring, what kind of response rate you get, for instance. And then there are different kinds of data, and there are different things that you might do with it. So you might be using this kind of population context where you can use the census information, and you might want to match that in your data collection so that you can talk about the people who've engaged with what you're doing in the context of the population of a local authority or a catchment area, or where you're trying to target particular kinds of people within a community. we're in this kind of slightly in-betweeny time where the census data for 2021 has been relaunched, but it's not everything. But they do have two sort of natty online kind of infographic-y interactive things that you can use for the 2021 data on most protected characteristics now. So it is possible to kind of see what has changed in your area. Geography, we love a map, we love postcodes, we love all those things. They can tell us where people are from. We can use various kind of segmentation tools to talk about what people are like. So postcodes and where people are from, if that's the target of what you want to do and engage with people, the geography is important. We've talked a bit about documenting what activity it is. And in a way, at a base level, if you collect nothing else, just logging all the things about the activity, where it happened, who the partners were, what you delivered, how many people turned up, did they stay for the whole session, did they come in groups, all that documentation is all evaluation, because it's saying we set out to engage these people and we had a room full of people because we did this thing in a local community centre, for instance. So the activity logging, and it's also the worst thing to have to collect right at the end of a project, because you have to sort of trawl your memory for all the things. And if you forgot to count how many people were in a room, it's obviously difficult to go back and do that. Equally, it's difficult to go back to participants once they have left and moved on. So again, these things about, you know, outcomes are really important to capture in the moment, because going back to people is always quite tricky. And then at the top, we've got like kind of profiles. So whether that's a kind of segmentation tool like Audience Spectrum, or whether it's demographics. We know that there are challenges with demographics, but it shouldn't stop you trying to ask them and asking them in really specific categories, and having people self-identify against categories is the most inclusive and equal way of doing it, so that you're not having to put any judgment calls on, you're not having to categorize people, and you always have other and enable people to self-identify if none of the boxes work for them, and that you're really training anybody who's collecting data about why you're collecting that, whatever your reason is to have to collect demographic data. The behavioural and attitudinal comes in all sorts of forms, and then the outcomes. So you might overlay this with, your baseline of the population means that you can compare things against it. In terms of geography, where did your activity happen in the context of where audiences came from? The what, who, and all the rest of it, all the activity. You can do your kind of profiles and check that against the people that you targeted. Were they new audiences, different audiences? Did they do different things with you? And then did they enjoy, learn, change their views, and all those sorts of things? So you can use this as a kind of tool. And then we're saying, okay, so how are we going to kind of collect this information? So we can use those secondary sources. We can ask people for postcodes. Full postcodes are we love a full postcode. And most people do know their postcodes. There are certain situations where people won't give you their postcode because they think it's possible to kind of personally identify them from it. In rural areas and some places that is possibly the case, but it's a very small proportion of the households that you can do that with. But it might be appropriate to do that in more interesting ways, or just ask people to put a pin on a map, or describe where they're from in kind of different ways, depending on your kind of context and what you want to do with that data. The monitoring data about who people are might be about your EDI, equalities, diversity and inclusion policy. So you may be required to ask that kind of information, but you want to keep it as short and tight as possible. So if people start to saying, actually, we want social grade, you can really need to interrogate whether that is really absolutely necessary, because it's either 4 or 8 questions to ask that, and then you have to code it yourself. So just think through things like that. You can obviously get quite a lot from ticketing information or possibly your CRM system, or you can ask similar things in your surveys in terms of who did you come with, how many people were in your group, and those sorts of things. And then the outcomes is usually surveys. So those last two things may also be done in a qualitative way. So you're breaking down the kinds of information you want and thinking what kind of methods of data collection is going to be possible in terms of what it is you want to ask. So again, you don't want to do anything that is unnecessary. You want to be as efficient as possible. You want to have that balance of quantitative and qualitative, but there might be other things that you can do, which is photography or a bit of filming or vox pops or asking people to keep diaries. So there might be some other kinds of information that you can draw on that tell the story. Making sure that the research is accessible and appropriate to the needs. I think collecting data for kind of family events where you're trying to sort of divert parent, carers and guardians' attention away from their children. So it's sort of making sure that, you know, the children have a version and there's a grown-ups version. So just thinking of that situation, thinking if you need interpretation, using plain English, BSL, or any other kind of interpretation that enables people to be involved in the evaluation, and what resources therefore do you need. So as we've said, there's a kind of quantitative and qualitative, as we call them. So quantitative tends to be numbers, pretty standardized, kind of tick box. You're analyzing it to get kind of percentages. And you can present it in kind of visual ways. You're thinking about your sample size in terms of the robustness of it. So if you have a room full of, 150 people, there are little calculators online that you can use to say, well, if I want to get a representative sample, it should be this number. And obviously you're thinking about how you can randomly sample them, or you take a census, which is where everybody completes and provides information. Qualitative data collection is not designed to be representative of everybody. So you're often selecting out of your kind of research subjects or your activities where you would want to focus qualitative data collection. But it is really important for all sorts of reasons. It can either illustrate your quantitative data. So if there's a high percentage around something and you have a nice quote from somebody, you can have open questions in your surveys. It's always nice to put at the end, can you tell us anything else about your experience, or what 3 words would you use to describe them? And then you can do fantastic word clouds. So you can ask those open questions in surveys, or you can do them during interviews or discussion groups, or other ways that people kind of express what their response is and the benefits that they got from your activity. But it's very participant orientated, so you're adapting it to the situation. But this is where you might get some of those things that you perhaps didn't expect in your evaluation. Anything open, people might raise things, and it's whether those things are raised a number of times, or in group discussion people agree on those things, to decide whether that is significant in your evaluation. And it's good to kind of have a good approach to the analysis. So you're always going back to that framework. You're always looking for the things that demonstrate what it is that you wanted to achieve through your project. And I suppose the other thing is not being fixed when you're analysing that qualitative data, and being open to things that people say, even though they might be critical. But also not fixating on one thing that one person said that you like or that you dislike, because they may or may not be representative of the whole. But it's always good to say, the majority of people said this. There were a couple of people who had these other kind of thoughts. I think that I suppose this kind of openness can mean that you know, you kind of get scope creep in your evaluation. So, but it is possible to do things kind of in a qualitative way and sort of be able to kind of quantify those to some extent. So it is a little bit about, it's very much about how you analyze those things. But it is really useful in that qualitative where people self-define and they talk about things. And there are processes where you might do evaluative work where you do an open kind of discussion, and then you're hearing the way people are talking about things or things that are most important to them, that you can then convert into a quantitative survey, which you ask everybody, which means that you're asking things on their terms rather than your terms as a kind of project or producer or an organization. You might, as I've said, ask people things at the beginning and then come back to them at the end of a process. So you can track change, so you can make that kind of qualitative work kind of the difference between what they said at the beginning and what they said at the end. And you can do things where you are kind of scaling things within a qualitative context. So you can have a big discussion and you can say, so if you were going to say, you know, how confident do you feel between 0 and 10, with 10 being most confident, you can, you know, you can ask that in a qualitative environment. It's not a huge number, but it makes it easier to kind of sum up some of the things you might ask qualitative. And I think, again, when you're designing any kind of qualitative work, you're sort of going from the general to the specific. So the more specific you can get, and you're always sort of saying, you know, tell us more about that. So even if someone says, oh, I feel more confident, you can say, well, tell us more about that. And they might say, well, I'm an artist and I now feel more confident to go out and talk to an agent. So you want to, you know, that's your opportunity to sort of make those stories real rather than talking in generalities. I think that the other thing in terms of is just to think about how comfortable people feel in different environments. Some people might much prefer a one-to-one situation because they've never been in a group environment where they've been invited to express their opinion, and so they might find that quite challenging. So when you're recruiting for kind of in qualitative work, you want to really think about the environments that people might feel comfortable in, and that they are aware what kind of environment it might be that they come into. So there might be some instances where you think a qualitative discussion group is not going to be appropriate. But one really important thing to think about in that recruitment to those things is how you recruit them and what selections you might make. So you might have a kind of survey, a quick survey that you send out to people first to say, you know, have you been to the events? You know, who are you? You know, what are your characteristics and what's your general interest in what we're doing? So that you can then perhaps group people who might have commonalities, or you might want to get people in the group who can have a discussion about from different perspectives. It's always quite good to give, you can also give stimuli in those groups. So if you're thinking about how you might, you know, you might have videos and things like that and people kind of comment on it, or you can use creative techniques in order to enable people to express themselves in the way that's appropriate for them. So you might have a big kind of graph like this and say, this is the beginning of the project and this is the end of the project. And you can say, you know, top is positive and bottom is negative, and people kind of draw a line and then they annotate it to say, you know, the bits why they felt more positive or more negative. So there's lots of creative techniques. And there was a session actually the other day from the Centre for Cultural Value about creative techniques in association with evaluation. So I'm sure you can look that up. It's just being clear that your creative technique is facilitating the process of evaluation rather than being just creative for creative's sake. And that you might want to present your findings in a creative way. But you need to be making sure that you are getting the answers in a way that you can then kind of categorize or assign to your evaluation framework. Here's an example. This is my favorite example, which was a wall, I think, that they had at MoMA, New York, where they say, I went to MoMA and people, oops, sorry, and did these things. I grew. I went to MoMA and saw a coat, closet trash, and 2 water fountains. I'm sorry, it keeps moving randomly. I'm very disappointed I did not see a dinosaur. You call yourself a museum. I went to MoMA. Oh, I entered, I looked around, and I felt like I opened up. Beautiful sentiment there. So sometimes you can give people license to kind of tell you things if you ask them the kind of right question in the right context. Just a little moment, and there have been other sessions on collecting data in terms of digital engagement. I think it's really important to differentiate between, you know, if one of your ambitions is to grow the number of people who use your website for information and engaging with you, that's one thing. And that might be about tracking awareness with people digitally, and that might be locally, nationally, or internationally, compared to evaluating engagement with digital content and digital kind of creative content. So whether that's live streaming, podcasts, an online exhibition, or anything like that. So it's just that this latter is much harder in a way to evaluate, but you can use your analytics to see if people made their way to it. You can see the engagement with it, with whatever tool you happen to be using or platform. And there are some kind of age and geography statistics that come with it, but it is quite difficult to get much more specific than that with the analytics. So it might be that either you've got a kind of pop-up survey that you're encouraging people to respond to within the digital context, or in other ways of surveying people, you are asking whether they engaged in person and or digitally, and you can relate your findings to whichever one they kind of ticked. But it is still a bit challenging to really understand the quality of experience or the impact of engaging with things digitally. So I think it's if you've got ideas about that, then there's definitely opportunity for developing those methodologies. Right, we're coming towards the end. So yeah, these are the obvious things. I think it's also important not to kind of put your evaluation, often when you look at some of the social media, it says reach, and it's sort of more than the population of the UK. So I think when you're looking at all these analytics, it's using the figures that have some sort of meaning, even if they're not the biggest of the figures that you can find. And using all the natty tools that are coming with Google Analytics 4, hopefully, to be able to track the people through your website and understand their journey. And obviously the interactive element as well. Again, things like sentiment analysis are possible. Some of the tools are rather expensive to be able to do that. So it's just really being clear about what it is that you think will be useful to track in terms of what people say if they interact with you. And finally, I'm just going to say at this moment, if anybody has got any specific conundrums or questions out of what I'm saying, I'll stop in a few minutes. So we've got a bit of time at the end just to take any questions. So please pop them in the chat, or when I stop sharing, you can put your hand up with a little tool. But I think, yeah, so the final bit really is, so what? You've done all this evaluation, and notoriously you hear people say, oh, we did this evaluation and it's just sat on the shelf and nobody's done anything about it, or it just went to the funder because that's what they wanted. We just asked the stuff that they wanted. So I would really, really encourage you to use it as a kind of creative, purposeful thing, and find ways to sort of integrate it into your practice and your program, and your kind of management meetings, so that you are always constantly kind of reviewing and learning. And there are lots of things out there that people have written about their experiences, There's lots of things that are coming out obviously about the things that people have learned during the kind of lockdowns and COVID, things people have learned about their kind of digital experience. So I think really, draw on what other people have done, but always kind of really focus on, the learning that you're getting from it, and not being concerned that some things are a bit of an experiment. I think if COVID and the lockdowns and the last few years have shown us anything at all levels of society, learning from the good stuff and the successes and the things that didn't quite work is really a very positive thing. And it's never a failure to have learned something. It's always good. And it's the learning, it's the recognizing the learning, or that you might do it differently another time, that means that you're kind of developing and growing, and that in terms of evaluation, you're honoring, the time and the effort that people put in to respond to your questions or be involved in your evaluation. So the more transparent you can be about it, there is no doubt that there will be sensitive areas or slightly political with small p situations. But I think you have to talk about those in advance and say, it's like when people do event economic impact, there is a chance that you have a negative impact on your area. Just, you have to be sort of prepared for these things, and you have to be prepared to take your evaluation in its entirety, rather than somebody running off with one particular fact which serves their kind of purpose or that they like. Equally, you need to interrogate it to see whether you think that doesn't seem a little quite right, and that might be just a little mistake in how you analyze the data, or it might be something that you want to just kind of check back with and say, well, what do they really mean about that? Or, is that important? We often talk about this idea of weight of data. So if there's something that people come back with, that there is a large measure of agreement, and there's a large number of people who have the same kind of sentiment, then that obviously has a kind of weight to it, as opposed to a small number of people who have a very strong opinion about something. Now, they might be your very key stakeholders, so they might be important. So you're just looking at, who is it that's saying what that's very positive and very negative, and what, in the context of the whole project, what kind of weight does that evidence have in terms of your response in that formative way about what you might do again differently, or what you might adjust. So this is the very simple diagram. We plan, then we do it, and then we review, and you always review before you start the process again. So if you can embed that across your organization in these things, it's always very good. I know that things like board meetings, and they are always that moment where you sort of have to bring all this stuff together, but making sure that you're making a safe space for people to have a sort of honest conversation about things. And I think this kind of double loop learning actually doesn't sort of say, oh, this went well and this went badly, this was our success, these are the things we're going to change. Actually going back to your original framework and saying, well, did we design it in the right way? Why did we decide that we were going to do it that way? And why did we think that there would be that kind of change? So that you're really looking at the kind of reasonings, and that you're not victims of your own kind of worldview, or that, this really had to do this, so any question that it didn't is a bit kind of challenging. So again, you have to be a little bit more kind of open, particularly if you've been very, very deeply involved in the delivery of something. It is quite challenging, but really looking at, going back to the first principles at the end, and taking that opportunity. And then the final bit is just making sure that when you are bringing together your evaluation, that you are speaking to specific audiences. So I'm sure you've seen lots of people who've kind of done lovely infographics that sum up all their great things. Some people are persuaded by facts and figures and the numbers and money and all those sorts of things. Some people love the story of one particular individual who went through it, as long as we know that that individual is representative of a group of individuals. I think also what kind of level of detail is important. Is it going to, is someone else got to take your report and kind of use it, whether it's a fundraiser or a somebody in the local council? And while we know that it is great to do things, to kind of have outputs that are kind of creative, again, you just need to think of the readership. Are they really going to sit and watch a 10-minute video? Or actually, do they just want a one-page of A4 and some images? So if you're having some kind of event or activity that sums up what you've learned and the outcomes and successes of a project, then obviously having a range of media is fantastic. But again, it's just really thinking where you're going to put your resource in terms of that presentation of the data, because it can be relatively expensive. Great. And yeah, there are various ways of kind of presenting things. So this is one example of putting something together so that it's a good kind of sum up and it's engaging for people. And it's these sorts of things that are helpful when you know, people need to see, you know, where the money went for some extent. But there might be other things that are more, which are softer, which kind of say, you know, these are the people whose lives were changed, or they did something different. So you just suit your context.